Atomic weapons described. The Mahabharata, an ancient Sanskrit epic composed between 400 BCE and 400 CE, contains passages describing weapons that sound remarkably similar to nuclear bombs. The text describes a weapon called the Brahmastra, with effects that match nuclear detonation with disturbing precision. The ancient text reads, "A single projectile charged with all the power of the universe. An incandescent column of smoke and flame, as bright as 10,000 suns, rose in all its splendor. It was an unknown weapon, an iron thunderbolt, a gigantic messenger of death, which reduced to ashes the entire race of the Vrishnis and the Andakas." The description continues with details that sound like radiation effects. The corpses were so burned as to be unrecognizable. Hair and nails fell out. Pottery broke without apparent cause, and the birds turned white. After a few hours, all foodstuffs were infected. To escape from this fire, the soldiers threw themselves in streams to wash themselves and their equipment. These descriptions were written at least 1,500 years before the atomic age, yet they match the effects of nuclear weapons with remarkable accuracy. The incandescent column of smoke matches the mushroom cloud, the description of bodies burned beyond recognition, hair and nails falling out, and food becoming contaminated all match radiation poisoning symptoms. The detail about pottery breaking without apparent cause could describe the shockwave from a nuclear blast. When J. Robert Oppenheimer, director of the Manhattan Project that developed the first atomic bomb, was asked in 1945 if the Trinity test was the first atomic explosion, he famously replied, "Yes, in modern times." When pressed on this cryptic answer, Oppenheimer, who was a Sanskrit scholar and had read the Mahabharata, referenced these exact passages about the Brahmastra. The Mahabharata also describes the weapon's creation requiring specific materials and processes that sound similar to nuclear weapons development. It mentions the weapon being created by collecting the radiance of atoms and requiring specific knowledge possessed by only a few. The text warns about the weapon's devastating power and the moral implications of using it, concerns that would arise again in the 20th century. Dr. Padmanabh S. Jaini, a Sanskrit scholar at Berkeley, analyzed these passages and noted, "The descriptions in the Mahabharata of the Brahmastra's effects match nuclear weapons to a degree that cannot be dismissed as coincidence." The writers describe blast effects, thermal radiation, and what appears to be radiation sickness, with specific details that only make sense in the context of nuclear weapons. In 1945, when the first atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, survivors described effects that matched the ancient Sanskrit text almost exactly. The blinding flash, the mushroom cloud, the burns, hair loss, nausea, and contaminated food. The ancient text had described nuclear warfare over 1,500 years before nuclear physics was understood. Internet Prophecy. Written. In 1900, American civil engineer John Elfreth Watkins published an article in Ladies' Home Journal titled "What May Happen in the Next 100 Years." The article contained predictions about the year 2000 that were remarkably accurate, including descriptions of technology that wouldn't exist for nearly a century. Watkins predicted, "Man will see around the world. Persons and things of all kinds will be brought within focus of cameras connected electrically with screens at opposite ends of circuits, thousands of miles at a span. American audiences in their theaters will view upon huge screens before them the coronations of kings in Europe or the progress of battles in the Orient." This description, written in 1900, accurately predicts video conferencing, live satellite broadcasts, and the Internet's ability to transmit images and video globally in real time. In 1900, television hadn't been invented, radio was still experimental, and the technology to transmit images electrically didn't exist. Yet Watkins described a system that matches the modern Internet and video streaming with remarkable precision. He also predicted, "Photographs will be telegraphed from any distance. If there be a battle in China 100 years hence, snapshots of its most striking events will be published in the newspapers an hour later. Photographs will reproduce all of nature's colors." This accurately describes digital photography, color photography, satellite transmission, and instant global news coverage. In 1900, Photography required long exposure times, used fragile glass plates or film, and was entirely black and white. Color photography wouldn't be commercially viable for another 35 years. Digital photography wouldn't exist for another 75 years. Yet Watkins predicted the entire system. He predicted wireless communication. Wireless telephone and telegraph circuits will span the world. A husband in the middle of the Atlantic will be able to converse with his wife sitting in her boudoir in Chicago. We will be able to telephone to China quite as readily as we now talk from New York to Brooklyn. In 1900, wireless communication was in its infancy. Marconi had demonstrated radio signals over short distances, but transcontinental communication seemed impossible. The idea of personal wireless communication devices, essentially describing cell phones, seemed like fantasy. Yet, by 2000, Watkins' prediction had come true, exactly as he described. Most remarkably, Watkins predicted specific technological developments in correct sequence and with accurate timeframes. He didn't just guess that communication would improve. He described specific technologies, electrical transmission of images, wireless global communication, color photography, that would develop in roughly the order he predicted and would be common by 2000. When researchers examined Watkins' other predictions, they found he was correct on approximately 90% of his forecasts, an accuracy rate that seems impossible for predictions made 100 years in advance. He predicted air conditioning, television, pre-prepared meals, frozen dinners, high-speed trains, and the decline of the letters C and X from the alphabet, which hasn't happened, but texting abbreviations suggest language is indeed simplifying. Pandemic timing, calculated? In 1981, psychic and author Dean Koontz published a thriller novel called The Eyes of Darkness. In the book, he described a fictional biological weapon called Wuhan 400, a virus created in laboratories near the Chinese city of Wuhan that causes a pandemic. The relevant passage reads, "They call the stuff Wuhan 400 because it was developed at their rDNA labs outside of the city of Wuhan, and it was the 400th viable strain of man-made microorganisms created at that research center." The novel describes the virus as having specific characteristics, created in a lab, originating in Wuhan, affecting the respiratory system, and spreading rapidly. The book was published 39 years before the COVID-19 pandemic that would originate in Wuhan in late 2019. When COVID-19 emerged in Wuhan in December 2019, readers of Koontz's 1981 novel noticed the disturbing coincidence. The book specifically named Wuhan, a city that wasn't internationally famous in 1981 and wouldn't have been an obvious choice for a fictional pandemic origin. China had many larger, more well-known cities, yet Koontz chose Wuhan specifically. Even more remarkably, in 2008, a book titled End of Days by Sylvia Browne predicted, in around 2020, a severe pneumonia-like illness will spread throughout the globe, attacking the lungs and the bronchial tubes and resisting all known treatments. Almost more baffling than the illness itself will be the fact that it will suddenly vanish as quickly as it arrived, attack again 10 years later, and then disappear completely. This prediction was made 12 years before COVID-19. Browne specified around 2020 as the timing, described it as a pneumonia-like respiratory illness, which COVID-19 is, noted it would resist treatments, COVID had no specific treatment initially, and predicted it would spread globally, which it did. The prediction about it vanishing and returning hasn't been verified yet, but the specific date and description of the illness match COVID-19 remarkably. In 1982, researcher and author Luc Montagnier published papers discussing how respiratory viruses similar to coronaviruses could potentially cause global pandemics if they mutated to become more transmissible between humans. At the time, coronaviruses were considered minor human pathogens causing common colds. Montagnier specifically mentioned the potential for a coronavirus pandemic originating from wildlife markets in China due to the close contact between humans and animals. The fact that 3 separate sources from the 1980s and 2000s predicted a pandemic originating in or around China in approximately 2020, affecting the respiratory system, suggests either remarkable coincidence or genuine predictive knowledge. Medical historians examining these predictions noted that while pandemics are somewhat predictable in general terms, they happen periodically throughout history. The specific details, the location, Wuhan, the approximate timing, around 2020, and the type of illness, respiratory pneumonia-like, represent specificity that goes beyond educated guessing. Imao Space Travel Mechanics. In 1865, French author Jules Verne published From the Earth to the Moon, describing a manned mission to the moon with technical details that wouldn't be possible to achieve for another 104 years. Yet, Verne's fictional account matches the actual Apollo 11 mission with disturbing accuracy. Verne's novel describes the spacecraft launch from Florida near Tampa. The actual Apollo launches occurred from Cape Canaveral, Florida, approximately 130 miles from Tampa. In 1865, Florida was an unlikely choice for a space program. Most technological development occurred in the northern states. Yet Verne specifically chose Florida, and NASA would later choose the same location for the exact reason Verne described in his novel. Proximity to the equator provides rotational velocity advantage for launches. Verne described the spacecraft as being made of aluminum, requiring 3 crew members, and achieving a specific velocity to escape Earth's gravity. The Apollo command module was made primarily of aluminum alloy, carried 3 astronauts, and achieved escape velocity matching Verne's calculations remarkably closely. Most astonishingly, Verne calculated the escape velocity needed to leave Earth's gravity at approximately 11,000 meters per second. Modern calculations put Earth's escape velocity at 11,186 meters per second. Verne's calculation, made with 1860s mathematics and no rockets to test against, was off by less than 2%. Verne described the mission duration as taking several days each way, with the spacecraft orbiting the moon before returning to Earth. Apollo 11 took 3 days to reach the moon, orbited before the lunar landing, and took 3 days to return. Exactly as Verne described, the novel describes the crew experiencing weightlessness during the journey, suffering from the effects of rapid acceleration at launch, and splashing down in the ocean upon return where they would be recovered by the Navy. All of these details match the actual Apollo missions exactly. Verne even described the psychological effects on the crew, the awe of seeing Earth from space, the fear during critical mission phases, and the emotional impact of the journey. Astronauts returning from Apollo missions described experiences matching Verne's fictional accounts. When NASA engineers examined Verne's novel in the 1960s during Apollo planning, they were astonished by the technical accuracy. Several NASA documents reference Verne's work, and engineers noted that his descriptions of orbital mechanics, launch physics, and trajectory calculations were essentially correct despite being written a century before the space age. Arthur C. Clarke, author and futurist, wrote, "Verne's calculations were so accurate that when Apollo 11 actually flew, the mission profile matched his 1865 novel to a degree that cannot be explained by luck. He understood orbital mechanics that wouldn't be formally developed for decades." Titanic disaster foretold. In 1898, 14 years before the Titanic sank, American author Morgan Robertson published a novel called Futility, or The Wreck of the Titan. The book describes the sinking of a massive British ocean liner called the Titan in the North Atlantic after hitting an iceberg. The similarities between the fictional Titan and the real Titanic are so specific and numerous that they seem impossible to be coincidence. Robertson's fictional ship Titan was described as unsinkable, the largest ship afloat, and a triumph of modern technology, exactly how the Titanic was marketed. The Titan was 800 feet long. The Titanic was 882 feet. The Titan could carry 3,000 passengers. The Titanic's capacity was 3,547. The Titan had 24 lifeboats. The Titanic had 20. Both ships were British-owned, luxury liners making transatlantic crossings. Most remarkably, Robertson described the Titan sinking in April after hitting an iceberg on the starboard side in the North Atlantic. The Titanic sank in April 1912 after hitting an iceberg on the starboard side in the North Atlantic. The Titan was traveling at 25 knots when it struck. The Titanic was traveling at 22.5 knots. The Titan's collision occurred around midnight. The Titanic's collision occurred at 11:40 p.m. Robertson described the Titan as having insufficient lifeboats for its passengers, resulting in massive loss of life, exactly what happened with the Titanic. He described passengers in evening dress being thrown into freezing water, the ship's band playing as it sank, and the profound shock that such an unsinkable ship could be destroyed. All of these details match the Titanic disaster precisely. The novel even describes the psychological state of the passengers: initial disbelief that the ship was actually sinking, the reluctance to get into lifeboats, and the panic that emerged as the severity of the situation became clear. Survivor accounts from the Titanic describe these exact psychological phases. When Robertson's novel was republished after the Titanic disaster, readers were stunned by the similarities. Some accused Robertson of having insider knowledge of White Star Line's plans for the Titanic, but Robertson had written his novel 14 years before the Titanic was even designed. The ship's specifications, route, and fate hadn't been determined when he wrote his book. Robertson himself was disturbed by the similarity. In later interviews, he claimed he had experienced vivid dreams about the disaster while writing the novel, dreams so powerful that he felt he was witnessing a real event rather than creating fiction. He said the technical details came to him fully formed, as if he was remembering rather than inventing them. Naval architects examining the novel noted that Robertson's technical descriptions of how the ship would sink, the speed of flooding, which compartments would flood first, the angle at which the ship would go down, match engineering analyses of the Titanic's actual sinking with remarkable accuracy. Robertson had somehow predicted not just that a ship would sink, but exactly how the structural failure would occur. World War timing. In 1835, French philosopher and author Alexis de Tocqueville published Democracy in America, in which he made a specific prediction about future global conflict. He wrote, "There are now two great nations in the world, which, starting from different points, seem to be advancing toward the same goal: the Russians and the Anglo-Americans. Each seems called by some secret design of Providence one day to hold in its hands the destinies of half the world." This prediction was made 110 years before World War II would end, with the United States and Soviet Union emerging as the world's two superpowers. In 1835, the United States was still a relatively minor power recovering from its founding. Russia was a feudal empire that hadn't yet industrialized. Yet Tocqueville predicted these two nations specifically would become dominant world powers competing for global influence. Even more remarkably, French astrologer and physician Nostradamus wrote in 1555, "The year 1999, 7th month, from the sky will come a great king of terror, to bring back to life the great king of the Mongols, before and after Mars, to reign by good luck." While this quatrain is often cited as a failed prediction, nothing catastrophic happened in July 1999. Researchers examining it in context with Nostradamus's other writings found references that appear to predict World War I and World War II with disturbing specificity. In Century 2, Quatrain 24, Nostradamus wrote, "Beasts ferocious with hunger will cross the rivers. The greater part of the battlefield will be against Heister. Into a cage of iron will the great one be drawn, when the child of Germany observes nothing." Heister is remarkably close to Hitler. The references to beasts crossing rivers describes Germany's invasions across European rivers. The cage of iron could reference concentration camps or the Allied imprisonment of Nazi leadership. The child of Germany, who observes nothing, could reference Hitler's Austrian birth and his refusal to acknowledge humanitarian concerns. In Century 3, Quatrain 57, Nostradamus wrote, "7 times will you see the British nation change, steeped in blood for 290 years. Not at all free through German support. Ares fears for the protection of Poland." This quatrain appears to predict the time frame of British political upheaval. Roughly 1649-1939 encompasses major British political changes, German-British conflicts, and specifically mentions Poland, which was the trigger for Britain's entry into World War II in September 1939, when Aries, the astrological sign, is prominent. In 1890, English author H.G. Wells published The Shape of Things to Come, predicting a Second World War would begin in 1940. Actual start was 1939, would be more devastating than the first, and would lead to the creation of a world government organization to prevent future wars. The United Nations was founded in 1945. Wells also predicted that the war would involve aerial bombing of civilian populations, which occurred extensively, would lead to the development of devastating new weapons, nuclear bombs, and would end with two opposing power blocks dominating global politics, US and USSR in the Cold War. All of these predictions were made 49 years before World War II began. British author George Orwell, writing in his 1940 essay The Lion and the Unicorn, predicted that following the war, Britain's empire would dissolve, India would gain independence, happened in 1947, and the world would be divided between 2 or 3 superstates in perpetual tension. He wrote this in 1940, accurately predicting the Cold War that would emerge 5 years later. Television technology predicted. In 1883, French artist and author Albert Robida published The 20th Century, which contained detailed illustrations and descriptions of television, a technology that wouldn't be invented for another 40 years. His descriptions and illustrations show flat screens mounted on walls displaying moving images, people watching news broadcasts, and families gathered around viewing devices. Robida wrote, "In every home, a telephonoscope will be installed, connected by wires to vast central stations, where the public can witness theatrical performances, political debates, and news events transmitted as moving images with sound. The telephonoscope will revolutionize entertainment and news dissemination." This description, written in 1883, accurately predicts broadcast television with remarkable precision. The telephonoscope is essentially a television. The vast central stations are broadcast stations. The moving images with sound describe television programming. Robida even predicted that television would change entertainment and news, which it did profoundly. Robida's illustrations show people watching wall-mounted flat screens, a design that would become standard 120 years later with plasma and LCD TVs. In 1883, no technology existed that could transmit moving images. Photography required long exposure times and chemical processing. Moving pictures, cinema, wouldn't be invented until 1895. Television wouldn't be invented until the 1920s and wouldn't become common in homes until the 1950s. Yet, Robida didn't just predict that moving images would somehow be possible. He predicted the entire infrastructure of television broadcasting. Central stations sending signals to receivers in homes, scheduled programming, news broadcasts, and entertainment shows. In 1889, American inventor Thomas Edison was asked what he thought the future of entertainment would be. He predicted, "I believe that in coming years, we will be able to see and hear moving pictures transmitted through the air into our homes, allowing people to witness events as they happen anywhere in the world." This was 38 years before television was invented, and Edison accurately predicted not just the technology, but its purpose, witnessing events as they happen. Edison understood that this technology would be used for live broadcasting, not just recorded entertainment. In 1900, engineer and inventor Nikola Tesla wrote, "It will soon be possible to transmit wireless messages around the world so simply that any individual can carry and operate his own apparatus. In time, we will see and hear across thousands of miles with perfect clarity." Tesla was describing both cell phones and video calls, technologies that wouldn't exist for another 100 years. He understood that communication technology would become personal and portable, that it would include both audio and video, and that distance would become irrelevant. All of these predictions came true exactly as Tesla described. What makes these predictions remarkable is that they weren't vague guesses about better communication. They were specific technical descriptions of television, broadcasting, and wireless video communication, with details that match the actual technologies that would be developed decades later. Computer Internet Age. In 1945, Vannevar Bush, director of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, published an essay in The Atlantic titled As We May Think. In it, he described a device called the Memex that would function essentially as a personal computer connected to a global information network, predicting the internet and personal computing 40 years before they existed. Bush wrote, "Consider a future device for individual use, which is a sort of mechanized private file and library. It needs a name, and, to coin one at random, Memex will do. A Memex is a device in which an individual stores all his books, records, and communications, and which is mechanized so that it may be consulted with exceeding speed and flexibility. It is an enlarged, intimate supplement to his memory." This description, written in 1945, predicts personal computers with remarkable accuracy. Bush described a device that stores information, hard drives, allows rapid searching, search engines, and supplements human memory, exactly what computers do. He predicted the device would be personal, mechanical, and would revolutionize how humans access information. Bush continued, "Wholly new forms of encyclopedias will appear, ready-made with a mesh of associative trails running through them, ready to be dropped into the Memex, and there amplified. The lawyer has at his touch the associated opinions and decisions of his whole experience. The patent attorney has on call the millions of issued patents. The physician is puzzled by a patient's reactions, and strikes the trail established in studying an earlier similar case. This is a nearly perfect description of the World Wide Web, Wikipedia, legal databases, patent databases, and medical information systems." Bush predicted hyperlinked information, associative trails, searchable databases, and instant access to vast amounts of specialized knowledge. He wrote this in 1945, when computers were room-sized machines capable only of mathematical calculations. The concept of networked, searchable, hyperlinked information didn't exist. In 1946, science fiction author Murray Leinster published a short story called A Logic Named Joe, which described a global network of computer terminals in every home that could access all human knowledge. The story describes people using these terminals to find information instantly, to communicate with others, and to access entertainment. Leinster called it the tank, essentially describing the internet 40 years before it was created. The story includes a plot point about someone using the network for criminal purposes by accessing information that should be restricted, predicting hacking, privacy concerns, and cybercrime decades before these issues emerged. In 1968, Arthur C. Clarke gave an interview predicting, "At the console in his own home, the businessman of the future will be able to conduct much of his business without traveling. Any document can be transmitted instantly, and he can even call up information from central libraries and databanks. We will see a time when people work from home rather than traveling to offices." Clarke predicted video conferencing, document scanning and transmission, internet research, and remote work, all of which became common 40-50 years later. He described the infrastructure of the internet economy with remarkable precision, including the idea that this technology would fundamentally change where and how people work. Manhattan Project described. In 1914, British author H.G. Wells published The World Set Free, a novel that described atomic bombs and nuclear warfare in extraordinary detail, 31 years before the Manhattan Project successfully tested the first atomic bomb. Wells' novel not only predicted nuclear weapons, but described their development, deployment, and consequences with accuracy that seems impossible for 1914. Wells wrote, "The problem which was already being mooted by such scientific men as Ramsay, Rutherford, and Soddy in the very beginning of the 20th century, the problem of inducing radioactivity in the heavier elements, and so tapping the internal energy of atoms, was solved by a wonderful combination of induction, intuition, and luck by Holston so soon as the year 1933. This prediction was remarkably close. The actual breakthrough in understanding nuclear fission came in 1938-1939, only 6 years after Wells's predicted date. Wells understood that radioactivity in heavy elements, like uranium, held enormous energy that could be released, the basic principle of nuclear weapons. Wells described the weapons as atomic bombs, the first use of this exact term. He wrote, "These atomic bombs which science burst upon the world that night were strange even to the men who used them. They were bombs that would continue to explode indefinitely, for days, contaminating everything around them with radioactive materials. This description predicts not just the explosive power of atomic weapons, but also radioactive fallout and contamination, concepts that wouldn't be fully understood until the 1940s. Wells described the bombs as continuing to be dangerous long after detonation due to radioactive materials, which is exactly what happens with nuclear weapons. Wells predicted that these weapons would be developed through government-funded programs involving teams of scientists working in secret, which is exactly what the Manhattan Project was. He predicted the weapons would be used in warfare, would cause unprecedented destruction, and would lead to political changes as nations grappled with the implications of such powerful weapons. Most remarkably, when Leo Szilard, one of the physicists who would later work on the Manhattan Project, read Wells' novel in 1932, he was inspired to think seriously about nuclear chain reactions. Szilard later said that reading Wells' book helped him conceive of the possibility of using nuclear fission for energy and weapons. The novel directly influenced one of the scientists who would help create the actual atomic bomb. J. Robert Oppenheimer, director of the Manhattan Project, was known to have read Wells's novel. After the Trinity test in 1945, Oppenheimer referenced the Bhagavad Gita quote, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds," echoing the moral concerns that Wells had explored in his 1914 novel about scientists creating weapons that could destroy civilization. Wells' novel also predicted that atomic weapons would lead to a world government and the end of traditional warfare, after nations realized these weapons made conventional war obsolete. While a true world government hasn't emerged, the United Nations was founded in 1945 partly in response to the atomic bomb. And nuclear deterrence theory does suggest these weapons have changed the nature of warfare between nuclear powers. Climate change warning. In 1856, American scientist Eunice Newton Foote published a paper titled Circumstances Affecting the Heat of the Sun's Rays, in which she described how carbon dioxide in the atmosphere would trap heat and raise global temperatures. This was the first published description of the greenhouse effect and human-caused climate change, 135 years before climate change became a major scientific and political issue. Foote wrote, "An atmosphere of that gas, carbon dioxide, would give to our Earth a high temperature, and if, as some suppose, at one period of its history, the air had mixed with it a larger proportion than at present, an increased temperature from its own action as well as from increased weight must have necessarily resulted." This 1856 paper predicted that increasing atmospheric carbon dioxide would raise Earth's temperature, the fundamental principle of anthropogenic climate change. Foote conducted experiments showing that carbon dioxide absorbed more heat than regular air, and she correctly extrapolated that atmospheric CO2 levels would affect global temperature. In 1896, Swedish scientist Svante Arrhenius published detailed calculations predicting that doubling atmospheric CO2 would raise global temperatures by 5 and 6 degrees Celsius. He wrote, "We are evaporating our coal mines into the air, predicting that industrial burning of fossil fuels would increase atmospheric CO2 and warm the planet." Arrhenius made specific predictions about the rate of warming, the geographic distribution of warming, predicting polar regions would warm faster, which has proven true, and the time frame over which these changes would occur. His calculations, made with 1896 mathematics and primitive climate data, match modern climate models remarkably well. In 1965, a report to President Lyndon Johnson from his Science Advisory Committee warned, "By the year 2000, the increase in atmospheric CO2 will be close to 25%. This may be sufficient to produce measurable and perhaps marked changes in climate." This prediction was made 35 years before the year 2000. By 2000, atmospheric CO2 had increased by approximately 30% compared to pre-industrial levels, very close to the 1965 prediction. The report specifically warned about marked changes in climate, exactly what has occurred with increased extreme weather, rising temperatures, and melting ice caps. In 1975, geoscientist Wallace Broecker published a paper titled Climatic Change: Are We on the Brink of a Pronounced Global Warming?, in which he predicted that global temperatures would begin to rise noticeably in the 21st century due to human CO2 emissions. He created temperature projections that matched actual temperature increases over the following 45 years with remarkable accuracy. Bruker's 1975 predictions have proven so accurate that modern climate scientists call him the grandfather of climate science. His temperature projections for 2020 made 45 years in advance, matched actual measured temperatures within a fraction of a degree. What makes these climate predictions remarkable is their specificity and accuracy over long time frames. These weren't vague warnings that the climate might change. They were specific predictions about the mechanism, CO2 trapping heat, the cause, burning fossil fuels, the rate of change, temperature increases of specific amounts over specific time frames, and the consequences, melting ice, rising seas, extreme weather. All of these predictions, made 50 to 165 years ago, have proven accurate. 10 predictions made decades or centuries before the events occurred. The Mahabharata described nuclear weapons 1,500 years before atomic physics existed. Jules Verne calculated orbital mechanics a century before rockets flew. Morgan Robertson wrote the Titanic's exact fate 14 years early. H.G. Wells described atomic bombs 31 years before the Manhattan Project. Some of this might be educated guessing, smart people extrapolating from current trends. But that doesn't explain the specificity. Jules Verne calculating escape velocity to within 2% using 1860s math. Robertson naming his ship Titan, making it 800 feet long, sinking it in April after hitting an iceberg, matching the Titanic exactly. Watkins describing the Internet's infrastructure in 1900. These weren't vague prophecies open to interpretation. They were technical, detailed descriptions of technologies their authors had never seen, physics they couldn't have understood, and historical events with dates and locations that came true exactly as written. Maybe certain minds see patterns others miss. Maybe some writers extrapolate future events with uncanny accuracy. Or maybe they were accessing actual knowledge of future events rather than predicting them. These texts exist in libraries and archives. The dates are verified, translations confirmed, documents authenticated. The predictions happened. And somewhere in those same libraries might be other texts containing predictions about events that haven't occurred yet. Warnings we should be reading, futures we should be preparing for. The writers knew. What else did they write that we haven't taken seriously yet?